most common questions we're asked is, how is the metadata-based common data model defined in AgilePoint different from one you might define in other low-code platforms or through traditional application development? In traditional application development platforms, while integrating with the underlying IT systems, the app interacts with the siloed, data-centric metadata layer. In this example shown here, your IT stack might have a CRM, an ERP, or a custom database, and your application is bringing data together from all of these platforms to drive the business logic. Now, these systems expose a data-centric view using metadata and the data API, which is made available through the line of business system vendor. But it has no knowledge or understanding of the interactions with those systems. And the context of the relationships between the different systems is never captured. So as a result, you end up creating apps in silos. Now, the app, which might have multiple forms and business processes, generate hardwired scripts or queries in each asset to read data from multiple underlying systems. As an example, a customer object might be represented very differently in Salesforce, SAP, and your custom database. So as a result, you will have to expose 3 different customer object structures to your app, and in the app itself, we'll need logic to unify it and process it throughout the various steps of the flow, doing all of the heavy lifting. Now, because the app data source is not shared, data is then copied across each workflow or form. So for example, if you look at some of the more popular systems out there, such as Power Automate, it will have its own schema and does not share it with the UI layer, which is Power Apps. And the same is true in the world of Salesforce, where the MuleSoft layer has its own schema and does not share it with Lightning components. Whereas in the AgilePoint world, there is loose coupling between the underlying IT stack and the apps through the metadata abstraction layer. As mentioned previously, the common data model is designed to be process-centric, shared, and reused across multiple applications or projects. This ensures consistency and standardization of data, structure, and semantics across these different systems. The metadata helps drive consistency, interoperability, and an understanding of the data model across different applications and systems. As a result, this means that your apps will see a unified view of the customer object, which we used in our prior example. So your app won't have any inline queries generated or any scripts, and the whole interaction is purely through the metadata properties exposed via reusable assets, which form a common data model and app logic layer. So let's take a look at how a process-centric metadata layer can be composed and made available to my new application. So for this, let's jump on over into AgilePoint. Okay, so let's move over to App Builder, and we're going to add a new app. For this video, we're going to create a process-centric application, give it a name, and drop it into a category. We'll give our process model a name. And as you're seeing here, there are a variety of trigger points. Everything from using external user interfaces, various event-based triggers for databases, inbound email, scheduled processes, as well as event support for both SharePoint and Salesforce. But in our example, we're going to go ahead and leave this triggered by AgilePoint's built-in UI, eForms. We're going to give this a couple of swim lanes. And as you can see here, AgilePoint is asking me where I'd like to store the data for my application. Now, as you might have guessed, AgilePoint supports both a data-first approach, where I define my data in an external system or within AgilePoint's data entity, and bring that entity into my application. Or I can start with the application-first approach, where I simply bring in fields on the fly as needed, where 5 might come from a database, 5 from SAP, and 5 from Salesforce, as an example. But in our case, we're going to use the built-in data designer, and I know that I have a table called customer. So I'm going to filter based on custom entities only, We're going to select that table. And as you can see here, there are fields that I can omit if I don't need them. And AgilePoint is aware that there is a child table here for order history. Additionally, I can bring in additional application artifacts, things like connection strings to external systems, document repositories for any attached files as a part of our app, style sheets, images, JavaScript, and I can always add all of these things later on. I can secure my application, but for now, let's go with the default security. And because this is a process-centric application, it's going to drop me in to the automation builder. Now, as you'll see on the right-hand side, my application is already aware of my external data sources. So here's my parent entity, as well as my child table. But I'm not limited to the data sources that I've specified initially. As an example, I might have, say, a product catalog as an example, available within another system. So in this case here, I would navigate over to SharePoint. And I'm simply going to point AgilePoint towards the list that holds my product information. Now, I know that my list is located at the root site, and I'm going to search for a list called products. Now down below, I can specify my synchronization rules, and just as with the entity, I can also select fields that I might require. But for now, let's go ahead and click Finish. So as you can see, I now have my SharePoint data source available in the Data Source Explorer. Now, as you can see on the right-hand side, this is a truly hybrid data source. There might be fields that are not yet bound to a data source. Now, in my case, I don't yet have any. We could have process variables, and we'll come back to that here in just a moment. Additional external data sources. System tokens, which are available throughout AgilePoint, as well as any globally defined variables. Okay, so what we're going to do next is define a process variable that we're going to use a little bit later on in the video. I'm going to call this the ID, and we'll leave it as type of string. Now, as we showed earlier, we can always define our data ahead of time, but that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. So on the left-hand side, AgilePoint has integrations into more than 110 cloud and on-premises line of business systems and are abstracted such that it does not require expert-level skill sets. So scrolling through the list, you're going to see OCR solutions, relational databases, both cloud and on-prem, office productivity solutions from Microsoft as well as Google, as well as leaders in categories like CRM and ERP. So think Salesforce and SAP as an example. Now let's take a look at Salesforce as an example. This is fairly representative of the level of integration and abstraction that AgilePoint brings. For most providers, when they talk about an integration, it is basic CRUD actions: create, read, update, and delete. But as you're seeing here in this list, I have roughly 25 or so actions within Salesforce alone, including a number of which that would require separate API calls. So not only is the integration reducing the technical barrier to build a complex application, it's also working to keep the process model very clean and concise. So to show you how this is going to work, I'm going to create a record in Salesforce. Now the first thing that I'm going to do here is select how I'm connecting to Salesforce. So my IT department has created a connection into Salesforce that I have permission to use. And let's go ahead and create a lead. So first, we're going to configure the request mapping. On the left-hand side, I have my AgilePoint hybrid data structure. So you're seeing my external source, the parent and child table, my SharePoint data source, as well as any process variables. Now on the right-hand side is a real-time exploration of the data structure in my external system, in this case, Salesforce. Now as I scroll through the list, you're going to see even the customized columns that I've created here for this particular object, as noted by the __C. So now, without any Salesforce expertise, it's a very simple mapping exercise where I would map name to name, email to email, address to address, and etc. And I could go on and continue finishing my mapping. Now on the response side, you're going to see that the data structures have flipped sides. On the right-hand side is my AgilePoint data structure, which becomes my target, and on the left-hand side is my Salesforce data structure. So what I'm going to do here is save the ID that Salesforce gives me into that process variable that we've defined just a moment back. Now in that example, we've just created a record, but the exact same would be true if I were to query a record. So again, I'm going to specify how I'm connecting to Salesforce. Again, we're going to query a lead. And it's going to do a real-time discovery of all of the columns in the lead object. Now I can select all of these individually and move them over, or I can use select all and bring them across. Now from a where clause perspective, what I'd like to do here is use the ID and the process-centric metadata variable that we defined just a moment ago. Now, whatever comes back from this query can be mapped back to my existing schema, but the advantage here is that once I have created this query, it is now available to me through all subsequent steps in the process. I don't need to keep performing the same query over and over and over again. And you're going to see that in the next step here. So from here, I'm going to drag and drop a human activity. We're going to add a new form. And as we mentioned earlier, that same process-centric schema is now available at every layer of my application. Now there might be certain scenarios where I want to drag and drop a field that is not bound to my existing data structure. So as an example, if I were to drag and drop a text box, and we'll call this submit as an example, we're going to see that my form fields are growing. On the other hand, if I drag and drop a node from my external data source, say name as an example, you'll notice that my form schema is not growing. And this little database icon here is telling me that this is a data bound field, so that when data is entered and submit is clicked, it will instantly synchronize with my external data source. So to summarize, if I add a node or if I add data to my process-centric metadata layer, it is now available through all application assets.